The pain was what woke me. A violent, shocking slam against my shoulder that sent me staggering back, my head connecting with the wall behind me with a dull thud. White spots danced in my vision, and for a moment the world tilted on its axis. When it righted itself, it was to the sight of Cale's face, contorted with a rage so pure and personal it stole the air from my lungs. "Liana, do you have a heart at all? Do you possess even a shred of compassion?" His voice wasn't just loud. It was a weapon sharpened on bitterness and aimed directly at me. The pre-exam chatter in the hallway died instantly, leaving a vacuum filled only by his fury. "Nina is depressed. Clinically depressed. She can't take it anymore and she jumps. Can you take that responsibility? Can you live with her blood on your hands?" Before I could even form a coherent thought, his shadow, his ever-present echo Jax, materialized at his shoulder. A sneer twisted his handsome features, making them ugly. "You're just jealous, Liana. We all see it. You know perfectly well the girl Cale loves is Nina. Yet every single day you use studying this stupid exam as an excuse to keep them apart. And now, on the day of the college entrance exam itself, you're still here blocking him. It's pathetic." The hatred in Cale's eyes wasn't just anger. It was the look you give an enemy, a monster you need to vanquish. A chill, cold and insidious, crept up from the soles of my feet, prickling my scalp and settling deep in my bones. This was the moment. I recognized it with a terrifying, soul-deep certainty. This was the moment everything had shattered in a life I had already lived. Cale and I, we were two saplings from the same barren soil. Our village was a forgotten speck on the map, a place where the mountains were steep and the opportunities were flat. Our high school tuition hadn't been paid by parents who scrimped and saved. It had been scraped together by the entire village. I could still feel the press of those calloused hands, smell the scent of earth and sweat on the crumpled bills they pressed into our palms. $1 from the widow Lee, 50 cents from old man Zhang. It was an investment, a silent, desperate prayer from an entire community. I knew this college entrance exam wasn't just a test. It was a drawbridge over a moat of poverty, and it was being raised after this one single crossing. There would be no second chance. The village could never afford to send us to repeat another year. If we failed, we would return not as heroes but as cautionary tales, to pick up a sledgehammer or a trowel and disappear into the faceless, anonymous crowds on construction sites, our dreams buried under concrete and dust. Changing my fate was the single most important thing in my life. It was the axis upon which my entire world spun. Compared to that, romance teenage drama wasn't worth more than 2 extra steamed buns from the school canteen. I had tried to stop Cale and Nina from being together not out of malice, but out of a desperate, frantic need to keep him on the path. He kept skipping classes, wasting precious, irreplaceable study time on whispered conversations and secret rendezvous. How was that wrong? I only wanted him to get into a good university, to make something of himself, so we wouldn't fail the villagers who had looked at us, 2 skinny kids from the mountains, and seen a glimmer of hope. That's why in my first life, when less than 30 minutes remained before the exam and I heard Cale was going to run 10 kilometers to the rooftop of a 50-story building to save Nina, I thought he had lost his mind. I had done the logical thing, the same thing. I called the police. They would be faster, more equipped, the professionals in a crisis. If he missed this exam, he would be throwing away every sacrifice, every prayer, every calloused hand that had helped him get here. He would only end up like my father, his back permanently bent from a lifetime of swinging a sledgehammer, his spirit crushed by the weight of a future that had never arrived. I had dragged him with all my strength, my nails digging into his arm, my voice a desperate plea against the roaring in my ears. I had pulled him, fighting and cursing, into the exam hall so he would sit the test. Because of that, he and I were both admitted to top-tier universities. Jax, with his lazy arrogance, only managed to get into a junior college. For a fleeting moment, it seemed we all had bright futures ahead of us. But because Cale hadn't gone in time, Nina was persuaded down from the rooftop by a tall, handsome firefighter with a kind smile. She fell in love with her rescuer, her knight in shining turnout gear, and completely cut ties with Cale. He lost the love of his life, or so the story went, and he blamed it all on me. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache that had no place in this present moment but felt utterly real. The push, the feeling of weightlessness, the wind screaming in my ears, the ground rushing up to meet me with terrifying finality. When the police arrested Kale, Jax was still there, defending him to anyone who would listen. You don't understand. Exams happen every year, but he lost the woman he loved most. If it weren't for Liana, Nina wouldn't have married someone else. Kale, don't be afraid. 18 years later you'll be a hero again. When you get out we'll still be brothers. Online, in the court of public opinion where facts were irrelevant and drama was king, countless strangers had taken Kale's side. So what if she died? The poor guy lost his one true love. Because Liana stood in the way, he could only watch helplessly as the girl he loved pledged herself to her rescuer. How much must that hurt? Jax had even turned that broken, twisted love story into a source of internet fame, a content stream of tragic what-ifs. Meanwhile, my death was dismissed as something I had brought upon myself, a deserved consequence for standing in the way of true love. Ironic, isn't it? The sheer, breathtaking irony of it was a bitter pill I had already swallowed in another lifetime. Now standing here again, feeling the ghost of that fall in the marrow of my bones, I made a decision. I would not block him again. I would not be the villain in his story. I would let him be the author of his own destruction. He saw the change in my expression, the fight draining from my eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. He misinterpreted it as surrender to his superior logic. He smiled, a slow, smug curve of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. Makes sense. Exams come every year, but once love is gone, it's gone forever. Beaming now as if he had just won a great victory, he swore, "Don't worry, Liana. The rooftop where Nina is, it's less than 10 kilometers away. I'll save her and be back in time. Just don't tell the village chief or anyone else, or you'll be sorry." The threat was casual, but the intent behind it was as sharp as a blade. Our high school wasn't even ranked in the city. What did second in the grade on a mock exam matter? The college entrance exam was a nationwide single-log bridge, a brutal competition with millions of students, not a contest within one insignificant school. Even Kale, in some deep hidden part of himself, knew how absurd it was to run off and save someone right before the test, which is why he didn't dare let the village elders find out. But his arrogance was overflowing, buoyed by juvenile invincibility. He thought he could defy physics, traffic, and time itself. He forgot about the exam day gridlock, the agonizing wait for elevators in a skyscraper, the time it would take to persuade a distraught Nina to come down. He forgot the unbreakable rule. Once 15 minutes passed after the start of the exam, no one would be allowed into the test hall. Now, with less than 30 minutes left, he had no transportation. Where was he supposed to find all that time? In his dreams, apparently. I nodded, my expression one of helpless defeat. "I'm going into the exam hall," I mumbled, turning away. Jax, standing nearby, was quick to intervene, playing his part to perfection. "Kale, take my phone. You go save Nina. I'll be in the exam hall waiting. I'll check the route for you, keep you updated." Without a second thought, without a single moment of critical reflection, Kale grabbed Jax's phone and ran, a sprinter bursting from the blocks. As he fled, he sent a voice message, his voice breathless with dramatic urgency. "Nina, wait for me. I'm coming right now. Don't do anything stupid." While a river of anxious, focused students flowed relentlessly toward the exam hall, Kale was a single frantic fish swimming upstream, against the current of his own destiny. At that moment, I knew with a painful, crystalline clarity that our lives had split into two diverging roads, running in opposite directions toward irrevocably different futures. What surprised me, a detail that hadn't been in my first life memory, was that Jax, that sycophantic shadow, didn't go with him. In the past, whether it was skipping class to go to the internet cafe or sneaking off to meet Nina at the city square, the two of them had always been a package deal, a duo of mischief. Jax and I entered the exam hall side by side. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and sharpened pencils. He suddenly gave me a smirking look, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "I have to admit, I thought you'd stop that idiot. I thought you'd physically restrain him, keep him from running to his precious Nina." He leaned infinitesimally closer. "You and Kale, you both disgust me." His words landed not like a slap, but like the prick of a needle injecting a paralyzing toxin. I stared at him, my pen freezing in my grip. The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving began to click together in my mind with terrifying speed, forming a picture of such calculated malice it made me feel nauseous. "What?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "What do you mean by that?" It was as if some sinister thread inside my brain had suddenly connected all the strange, unreasonable details of the past year. Cale, accidentally, sneaking out at night and bumping into Nina, who was being harassed by thugs. A scene straight out of a bad drama. The two of them falling in love at first sight, becoming instantly, obsessively inseparable. Jax always there, always covering for Cale, even encouraging me to skip classes to live a little. But I had my eyes only on the prize, on the books that were my ticket out, and I kept telling them not to cut class, that it was a slippery slope. Whenever I said that, the two of them would exchange a look, a mocking, secretive glance that I had dismissed as them thinking I was a bore. Forget her. Don't hang around with a bookworm. All she knows is studying. Acts like someone's mom. Nags even worse than mine. Let's go play. Don't take her along. To help Cale and Nina, Jax had even given them his prized smartphone, the one his father had bought him as a reward for a decent test score, so they could chat on WeChat during class. Now, in the hushed, tense silence of the exam hall, with the proctors about to distribute the papers, Mark suddenly laughed out loud, a short, sharp sound that drew the attention of everyone around us. "You don't really think he's going to make it back, do you?" he said, his voice no longer a whisper but carrying a cruel, conversational tone. He was performing now, and I was his captive audience. His mock exam papers, the ones that placed him a steady number 2, he paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. I fed him the answers ahead of time. That idiot still thought he was smart. No wonder he kept skipping class, playing on his phone, and yet his ranking never dropped. That's because of me. I stared at him, my blood running cold, freezing solid in my veins. He had done it on purpose. It wasn't just petty jealousy. It was a long, deliberate campaign of sabotage. Jax looked thrilled at my horrified expression, at the dawning comprehension that must have been plain on my face. "Didn't expect that, did you? My old man's always yapping in my ear about how you two are outstanding, the top students, the hope of the school. If only you had half their brains, Jax. I want to see what his face looks like when his two precious star pupils both fail to get in." My dad will choke on his own words. Jax's father was our homeroom teacher, Mr. Thorne. A kind, dedicated, if somewhat stern man who often gave Cale and me extra lessons on weekends, who had kept us at his house for dinner and tutoring, who saw in us the potential his own son seemed to lack. I'd heard him scolding Jax more than once, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You're dumb and lazy, Jax. If only you had half their brains, I'd be satisfied. Those two can definitely make it into a top-tier university. They can be bold in filling out their applications. As for you, Jax, if you can just get into a third-tier school, I'll count it as a blessing from our ancestors." I had always thought those were just the harmless, frustrated jabs of a teacher and a father trying to motivate his son. I never imagined the resentment had festered so deeply, so poisonously, in Jax's heart that he would orchestrate this elaborate, ruinous scheme. It was a bright, sunny day outside the large windows of the exam hall, but my scalp went cold and tight, a wave of dizziness washing over me. I never would have thought that the classmate who had sat next to me for 3 years, who had shared snacks and complained about homework, could harbor such calculated, venomous hatred. Jax, pleased with the devastation he was causing, leaned in closer, his voice dropping back to a venomous whisper, ready to plunge the knife in deeper. "You know your dad's swinging a sledgehammer on a construction site," he began, his eyes glinting with malicious delight. "But do you know what your mom's doing there?" My stomach clenched into a hard, cold knot of dread. He leaned in, his breath a foul whisper against my ear. "Your dad sells his strength, and so does your mom, but on other people's bodies." A vile, triumphant smile twisted his lips. "I've been there. You know, she's got a red mole on her inner thigh, right? You can't deny it. That skill of hers looks like something she's honed for years. If you don't get into college, you'll just go back and take over her job. Don't worry," he sneered. "I'll be a loyal customer." Laughing viciously, he raised his hand, reaching out to touch my cheek, a gesture of ultimate contempt. "How dare you think you deserve college? With your kind, the only thing you'll end up doing is selling yourself." Hearing his filthy, degrading words, a red-hot primal fury surged through me, so intense I saw a flash of white behind my eyes. I wanted nothing more than to slap him, to scream, to rake my nails down his smirking face. But I forced myself to take a deep, shuddering breath, my hands gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. That was exactly what he wanted, to rattle me, to shatter my concentration, to make me fail this exam just as he had engineered Kale's failure. I could not let him win. I took another breath, studying the wild, surging storm of my emotions, pressing down the fury that boiled inside me like a volcano. I ignored him. I turned my gaze forward, toward the blank test papers the proctor was now placing on each desk. I knew all too well that the more you respond to a creature like him, the more excited and relentless he becomes. He knew he couldn't score well himself, so his only victory lay in dragging those around him down into the mud with him. Yet every filthy word, every cruel action, only proved one thing, that he was desperate. He was a small, pathetic creature trying to dim the light of others because he had none of his own. The bell signaling the start of the exam rang, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the thick tension in the room. I inhaled deeply, and with that breath, I swept away all distractions. The betrayal, the fury, the chilling revelations about Jax's true nature. I built a wall in my mind, and on the other side of it I locked everything out. There was only the test paper before me. After the last mock exam, I had meticulously gone over every mistake I'd made, every conceptual misunderstanding, filling a whole notebook with corrections and revised strategies. Now it felt as if that divine preparation guided my pen. Question after question I knew the answers, my mind a clear, calm lake perfectly reflecting the knowledge I had worked so hard to acquire. Suddenly noise drifted in through the open windows. Shouts, a commotion, a rising wave of sound that was out of place. Many students around me turned to look, their concentration broken, their necks craning towards the windows. But I kept my head down, writing, my hand moving steadily across the paper. I would not be distracted. I had fought too hard to get here. Then I heard it. Unmistakable even from a distance. Kale's voice, desperate and panicked, ringing out from the direction of the school's main gate. I'm a test taker. I was only a little late. Please let me in. I was saving someone. Ask the police. They're the ones who brought me back here. But the proctor's voice was firm, cold, and utterly final. No. It's already more than 20 minutes past the start. You can't go in. The rules are absolute. Try again next year. Kale's cry that followed was a raw, guttural sound of utter despair. It was the sound of a future shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Then Nina's voice trying to soothe him, but her words were all wrong, laced with a scorn that made the situation worse. If they won't let you take it, then don't. Look at me. I didn't even go to high school and I'm still living. What's the big deal? Did you really think someone from a little place like ours could turn into a golden phoenix? If you want to study, we'll just repeat the year next time. Her tone then turned sharp, dismissive. Crying and making a scene here. What a shameful display. But Kale's voice carried only a desolate, hopeless despair that seemed to swallow the entire world. It's over. Everything's over. My parents will kill me. Repeat? How could I ever have the chance to repeat? The village, they'll never. On the podium, our head proctor banged his desk with a heavy textbook. Everyone. Focus. Mind your own papers. This is the college entrance exam. The sounds from outside faded, but the echo of Kale's ruin lingered in the air, a haunting specter at the feast. I kept writing, my resolve hardening into diamond with every stroke of my pen. Knowing Jax's poisonous thoughts and having just witnessed the direct result of his machinations, I could already guess what would come next. The narrative would be twisted. The blame would be laid at my feet just as it had been in my previous life. I was in the city for the exam with no parents around to protect me. I didn't even have a phone to call for help. I was vulnerable. I didn't dare take the risk. If Kale, unhinged by his loss and egged on by Jax's whispers, decided to seek revenge, he could break my hands, tie me up, ensure I never made it to the next day's exams. After experiencing life and death once, I had to prepare for the worst. I could not afford to gamble with the future I was so painstakingly writing back into existence. The plan began to form in my mind, cold and precise. I knew exactly where I needed to go for safety. I knew exactly who I needed to call to plant a seed of truth. The first battle, the exam, was nearly over. The second battle, the battle for my very survival, was about to begin. The final bell of the first exam day was a release, a collective exhalation of breath from hundreds of students. I stayed seated for a long moment after the proctors collected the papers, carefully organizing my pens, letting the initial rush of bodies subside. My mind was not on the chemical formulas I had just balanced or the essays I had written. It was on the chemistry of survival. Jax's venomous confession and Kale's very public downfall were a volatile mix, and I had no intention of being caught in the explosion. As I stepped out of the hall and into the river of chattering, relieved and anxious students, my senses were on high alert. I scanned the crowd, my body a tightly coiled spring. And there they were, just as I'd feared. A little island of turmoil near the main gate. Kale, his face a thundercloud of fury and devastation, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, clenched into white-knuckled fists. Jax was talking to him in a low, urgent murmur, a puppeteer adjusting his strings. And Nina stood slightly apart, her arms crossed, a strange, almost satisfied look on her face that didn't match the tragedy of the moment. I ducked my head, using the taller students as a shield, and changed direction, slipping down a side corridor. I wouldn't be going back to the cheap, shared dormitory the school had arranged. Instead, I walked with purpose, my footsteps sure on the familiar route I had mentally mapped out during the exam. 10 minutes later, I stood before the local police station, a solid, reassuring building of pale concrete with a bright national emblem hanging over the door. This was my fortress. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I pushed the heavy door open and approached the front desk. A middle-aged officer with kind, tired eyes and the competent air of someone who had seen everything looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you, young lady?" His voice was a low rumble, devoid of impatience. "Uncle," I began, my voice deliberately small, laced with a fear that was only half feigned. "My name is Liana. I'm here for the college entrance exams. But I have nowhere safe to sleep tonight." His brow furrowed, etching deeper lines into his forehead. "What's the matter? Where are your parents? Your classmates?" This was the story I had prepared, a careful blend of truth and strategic omission. "I'm from a mountain village, sir. I came alone. My classmate, the one who was late and missed the exam today, he blames me for it. He and his friends were waiting for me after the exam. They looked like they wanted to hurt me. I heard them say my name and they were so angry. I'm scared to go back to the dormitory. I didn't mention the knife I suspected Kale might be carrying. That would come later if necessary. For now, I needed sanctuary, not a full-scale investigation that could destabilize me before the final, crucial exams." The officer, his nameplate said Captain Reed, studied my face. He saw the genuine terror I couldn't fully hide, the dust on my worn-out canvas shoes, the simple faded clothes that spoke volumes of my background. He let out a long, soft sigh, the sound of a man who knew the world could be a cruel place, especially for those with no one to watch their back. "You can't rest well on a chair in the waiting area," he said finally, his voice gentler now. "We have a spare room in the back, usually used for lost children or material witnesses. It's not fancy, but it has a cot and a lock on the door. You can stay there." Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. "Thank you, Uncle Reed. Thank you so much." He waved off my gratitude as if it were a bothersome fly. "Have you eaten?" I shook my head. In the turmoil, I hadn't even thought about food. He nodded and disappeared into a back room for a moment, returning with a styrofoam box. "Here. It's just from the canteen, but it's hot." I opened the box. Inside was a generous portion of white rice, stir-fried greens glistening with oil, and a large braised pork chop. My mouth watered. Meat was a luxury I enjoyed maybe once a week. This simple, honest meal felt like a feast fit for an emperor. "Thank you," I whispered again, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. As I ate, the reality of my situation settled in. The warm food in my stomach, the solid walls around me, the presence of law enforcement. I was safe. For now. "Uncle Reed," I said after swallowing the last delicious bite. Could I make a phone call? I need to let someone know I'm safe." He smiled, a genuine, kind smile that reached his eyes. "You want to let your parents know, right?" "Of course. Go ahead." He gestured to the phone on the desk. I didn't dial my parents' number. They were a day's journey away on a remote construction site with no phone access. Their worry wouldn't help me and my call would only terrify them. I also didn't call the village chief. He was a good man, but he was old and far away. He couldn't protect me from the immediate physical threat. Instead, my fingers, trembling slightly, dialed the number I knew by heart. My homeroom teacher, Mr. Thorne. Jax's father. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice harried. "Hello? Mr. Thorne speaking." "Mr. Thorne?" It's Liana. Liana, where are you? Jack said you ran off after the exam. We've been worried sick. And Kale, my God, what happened to Kale? His voice was a torrent of anxiety and confusion. Mr. Davis, listen to me carefully. I'm safe. I'm at the police station near the exam hall. The police station? What have you done? The panic in his voice was immediate. I haven't done anything, I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to his. But I am in danger. Kale missed his exam because he ran to save Nina. He blames me for it. Jax is encouraging this. After the exam, Jax told me he's been feeding Kale the answers to the mock exams. He bragged about it. He said he wants to ruin both of us, so you'll stop praising us. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the desperate denial fighting with the dawning, horrible realization. The pieces of his son's sullen behavior, the inexplicable consistency of Kale's grades despite his absences. It was all clicking into a monstrous picture. That's absurd, Liana. Mark wouldn't. His voice was weak, the protest of a man watching his worldview crumble. He did, sir. He said he's tired of you comparing him to us. He wants to see the look on your face when your precious star pupils fail. I paused, letting the calculated cruelty of it sink in. He also said vile things about my mother. Things I won't repeat. I believe he and Kale mean to harm me, to prevent me from taking the rest of the exams. That's why I'm at the police station. I'm not leaving until I walk into the exam hall tomorrow morning. Another long silence. When Mr. Thorne spoke again, his voice was hollow, stripped of its usual academic authority. It was just the voice of a defeated father. I see. Stay there, Liana. Stay safe. I'll deal with this. Thank you, sir. I hung up, my hand trembling as I placed the receiver back in its cradle. The die was cast. I had thrown the first stone not out of malice but out of self-preservation. I had given Mr. Thorne the unvarnished truth. What he chose to do with it was now on his conscience. Captain Reed had been pretending not to listen, shuffling papers on his desk, but his kind eyes were full of a deep understanding. Trouble with classmates? He asked gently. You could say that, I replied with a weak, exhausted smile. He showed me to the spare room. It was small and Spartan, with a single metal-framed cot, a thin blanket and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. To me, in that moment, it was the most secure palace in the world. The walls were thick, the door had a solid lock, and the entire building was occupied by armed, trained officers. For the first time since I'd awoken to Kale's fury, I felt my shoulders relax, the tension leaching out of my muscles. As I lay in the dim light, I could hear the faint, comforting sounds of the station. The murmur of voices from the front desk, the clack of a keyboard, the occasional crackle of the police radio. I thought of Kale, somewhere out in the city, his future in ashes, his mind likely festering with Jax's poison. I thought of Jax, whose resentment had curdled into something truly monstrous. And I thought of Nina, a pawn who seemed to relish the drama she inspired. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the front of the station. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the cool, painted wood. It was Jax's voice, slick with false concern. We're just worried about her, officer. She's our classmate. She didn't come back last night. Her name is Liana. Then Kale's voice, raw and strained, cracking with emotion. I need to see her. She needs to explain herself. She needs to tell me why she did this to me. Captain Reed's voice was a low, steady rumble, a rock against their chaotic waves. She's safe. She's staying here tonight as a guest. You boys should go home and get some rest for your exams tomorrow. Exams? Kale's laugh was bitter, broken. What exams? He made me miss mine. He set me up. She knew I wouldn't have time. Is that so? Captain Reed's tone was neutral, non-committal. The report I heard was that you chose to leave the test center of your own volition, despite knowing the rules and the time constraints. She calculated it. This was Jax, jumping in, his voice laced with righteous indignation. She's good at math. She knew he wouldn't have enough time. She admitted it to me. She said their village is too poor to support 2 college students, that she was jealous of Kale. She wanted to be the only one from our village to make it. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a sickening dread. The lies were already being woven, the narrative constructed to make me the envious, manipulative villain. They were laying the groundwork, poisoning the well of public opinion just as they had in my previous life. Then I heard a third voice, soft and laced with fake trembling guilt. Nina. Officer, I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. Liana told me that if I just kept Kale from taking the exam he'd always stay with me. I only did it because I loved him too much. I didn't know how important the exam was. It's all Liana's fault. He just wanted to steal Kale's spot as the top scorer. The audacity of it, the perfect, poisonous alignment of their stories, took my breath away. They were a chorus of lies, their voices harmonizing to paint me as a jealous, scheming witch. I could picture Kale's face, his eyes turning bloodshot with renewed rage, his fists clenching. Jax would be standing just behind him, a twisted smirk hidden from the officer's view. If Liana were gone, I heard Jax say, his voice dropping to a suggestive conspiratorial murmur, then no one would run back to their village and start wagging their tongue. It would all settle down. There was a heavy, pregnant pause. I could imagine Kale chewing over those words, letting them fester in his ruined, desperate mind. The idea of me, the sole witness to his humiliation and the supposed architect of his downfall, simply vanishing. The simplicity of it. Then his voice, lower, harder, filled with a terrifying resolve. Yeah. If Liana were gone. The sound of their retreating footsteps was the most frightening thing I had ever heard. It wasn't the loud, dramatic threat of before. It was a quiet, grim promise. I slid down the door to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was real. The conspiracy was not just a memory from a past life. It was happening now in this one. Jax was the puppeteer, pulling the strings with chilling skill, and Kale was his enraged, broken puppet, now armed with a deadly purpose. And I was the target. A few minutes later, Captain Reed opened the door a crack, finding me huddled on the floor. His face was grim, his earlier kindness now replaced by a professional severity. You heard? He asked quietly. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He knelt down, his eyes level with mine. Don't you worry, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. You're under my protection now. No one is getting to you here. You get some sleep. I'll personally make sure you get to your exam safely tomorrow. His words were a lifeline thrown to me in a stormy sea. I crawled back onto the cot, pulling the thin, rough blanket up to my chin. The fortress walls felt strong, but I knew the monsters were right outside, waiting in the shadows, patient and full of hate. Sleep was a long time coming. When it did, it was filled with fractured dreams of falling, of Kale's hate-filled eyes, and Jax's endless, sneering laughter. The morning of the second exam day arrived, marked by a pale, tentative light filtering through the small, high window of my room. I had slept fitfully, my dreams a chaotic reel of falling bodies and Jax's sneering face. Captain Reed was true to his word. He woke me with a simple breakfast of congee and a boiled egg, and then, with 2 other uniformed officers flanking us, he personally escorted me back to the exam hall. Walking through the streets with a police escort was surreal. Passers-by stared, their whispers a faint, judgmental hum of speculation. I kept my head down, my focus turned inward, building a fortress of concentration around my mind. The most important exam of my life was in a few hours, and I could not afford to let the venom of others poison my focus. I was a soldier marching to the front line, and the battle ahead was all that mattered. As we approached the test center gates, the crowd was even thicker and more chaotic than the day before. Anxious parents offered last-minute advice, students chattered nervously, and hawkers shouted, selling pencils and bottled water. And there, like a dark stain on the periphery of the hopeful scene, stood Kale, Jax, and Nina. They saw me immediately. My police escort made me impossible to miss. Kale's face was a ghastly shade of pale, his eyes sunken and burning with a desperate, unstable fire. He looked like he hadn't slept, his hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled. His hands were still shoved deep in his pockets, his posture rigid with a tension that seemed ready to snap. Liana, he called out, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a shard of glass. Come here. Nina stood beside him, putting on a masterful performance of sweet, wounded concern. Liana, where did you run off to last night? Kale worried about you so much he couldn't sleep. As she spoke, my eyes, sharpened by fear, caught faint, reddish marks on her neck, barely visible above the collar of her shirt. My blood ran cold. Had Kale, in his frustrated, impotent rage after failing to find me, Taken it out on her last night? The thought made me feel sick. Jax stepped forward, playing the part of the reasonable, exasperated peacemaker to perfection. Yeah, we looked everywhere for you. My dad told me to take care of both of you. Even if you didn't come back to sleep, you should have at least said something. You can't just disappear like that. His words were a masterstroke, designed to sway the crowd and paint me as the irrational, problematic one. Immediately, whispers rippled around us, turning the curious stares into frowns of disapproval. What's a girl doing not going back with her classmates at night? Running around with who? The police? What kind of trouble is she in? Someone like that, why even bother with the college entrance exam? Just wasting the country's resources. The public shaming, the subtle destruction of my character had begun. This was their strategy. Isolate me, destroy my reputation, and let the court of public opinion deliver the first blow. If I were still the naive, proud girl from the mountains, I would have rushed over to defend myself, to protest my innocence, walking right into their trap and into Cale's reach. But Captain Reed had been in law enforcement for decades. He saw through the performance in an instant, his eyes missing nothing. The marks on Nina's neck, the calculated gleam in Jax's eyes, the dangerous rigidity in Cale's stance. His grip on my arm tightened, holding me firmly back. "Don't go over there," he commanded in a low, unwavering voice. In the next second he moved with a speed and decisiveness that belied his age. He pulled out his baton and strode straight toward Cale, his voice a thunderous bark that silenced the entire crowd. "Hands up. Out of your pockets now." The other officers closed in instantly, their presence shifting from protective to confrontational, forming a tight, professional perimeter. The scene unfolded in a series of frozen, nightmarish images. The shock on Cale's face quickly morphing into panic. The genuine fear in Nina's eyes as she realized the game had escalated beyond her control. The calculating, almost appreciative shift in Jax's expression as he assessed this new, unpredictable variable. Then a cry from a sharp-eyed parent in the crowd. "He's got a knife." Time seemed to slow, the sound stretching and distorting. Captain Reed reacted instantly, a predator lunging. He tackled Cale to the ground with a grunt of effort. There was a brief, violent struggle, a tangle of limbs, and then a glint of metal as a small, cheap kitchen knife clattered onto the pavement, skittering away from Cale's grasp. The other officers swarmed, efficiently pinning a now-thrashing Cale down and firmly restraining a suddenly silent Jax and a hysterically shrieking Nina. Cale thrashed wildly under Captain Reed's weight, his eyes wide and bloodshot, locking on me with pure, undiluted hatred. "Liana, this is all your fault. You ruined me. You'll pay for this. I'll make you pay," he screamed, his voice cracking with a fury so profound it seemed to tear at his very throat. Captain Reed shoved his head down hard against the rough concrete. "Calm down," he roared, the authority in his voice absolute. Jax, once restrained, fell completely silent, his mind doubtless whirring, recalculating his plans in the face of this catastrophic failure. But Nina was a loose cannon, shouting and twisting in an officer's grip, her hysteria a weapon of its own. "Why are you arresting me? I didn't do anything. Why don't you arrest her?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me. If it weren't for him egging me on yesterday, tricking Cale into leaving, none of this would have happened. Cale couldn't take the exam all because of him. Liana didn't dare come back last night because he was guilty, afraid the truth would come out. I stood my ground, my heart a frantic, terrified drum against my ribs. I couldn't help but marvel, even in my fear, at the intricate, poisonous web Jax had spun. He was always in the background, his hands seemingly clean, using others as his weapons and his shields. He had turned Nina into his mouthpiece and Cale into his blade. It became painfully, undeniably clear then. In my previous life, when Cale had shoved me off that high rise, it was Jax's voice that had undoubtedly been in his ear, whispering justification, twisting the narrative until murder seemed like a righteous, even necessary act. I knew I had to speak. I had to plant a seed of doubt in the onlookers' minds, and more importantly, I had to try to plant one in Cale's shattered psyche. I could not let their false narrative stand uncontested. I took a step forward, my voice quiet but clear, carrying over Nina's fading hysterics. Yesterday, right here, there were uncles and aunties, parents who had come to drop their kids off. They must have overheard me. Someone must have heard what I actually said to Cale when he wanted to leave. I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, making eye contact with a few. What exactly did I say to him then? And how has it been twisted now into this story? I then turned my gaze from the crowd to Kale, who was still pinned to the ground, his cheek pressed against the dirt. I walked slowly toward him, ignoring Captain Reed's warning look. I knelt just out of arm's reach and lowered my head to look him directly in his wild, pain-filled eyes. Kale, I said, my voice firm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos around us. Think carefully. Nina and I have never gotten along. He has always hated me. His disdain for me has always been out in the open. He never once tried to hide it. I paused, letting the simple, obvious logic sink past the fog of his rage. Back then, my mind was completely on studying on this exam. I never cared that he disliked me because arguing with him would have been a waste of my time I couldn't afford to lose. So, I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper, if you believed them so quickly, then they must have been saying other things behind my back. Lies about me. But really, I asked, the question hanging in the air between us, would I ever scheme against you for the reasons they gave? Pinned under Captain Reed's grip, Kale stopped struggling. The frantic, violent energy seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a dazed, bewildered confusion. He was finally, truly thinking, the fog of rage and manipulation beginning to lift, if only for a painful, illuminating moment. Officers, maybe this is a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding. A new, frantic voice cut through the tension. Mr. Thorne, our homeroom teacher, was pushing his way through the crowd, his face ashen, his tie askew, his satchel swinging wildly from his shoulder. He must have rushed over the moment he got my call or heard the commotion. The sight that greeted him, his son in police custody, his star student pinned to the ground with a knife nearby, and a hysterical Nina, seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. He looked like a man watching his entire life's work implode. The parents gathered around, their fear and protectiveness now boiling over, began shouting, their voices a chorus of outrage. What misunderstanding? We all saw the knife. Officers, take him away. What if he goes crazy and hurts my daughter? That's right. All these kids have exams today. This is a disgrace. If I had guessed right, this public ambush was Jax's idea. He wanted to use the crowd to pressure me, to corner me, and to dump all the blame onto my shoulders in a very public forum. If Captain Reed hadn't been there, if I hadn't already lived through death once and recognized the patterns, I would have walked right into it. I would have been stabbed, and in the ensuing chaos, my name would have been dragged through the mud, my character assassinated. The whispers would have followed me even in death. Why did he stab you and not anyone else? Must be because you deserved it. Must be because you stopped him from taking the exam. But Jax hadn't expected his father, the one man he truly feared and resented, to show up in the middle of his carefully staged drama. He hadn't accounted for the wild card of paternal shame and fury. I didn't care about teacher-student respect anymore. My life was on the line. My future was on the line. I raised my voice, addressing Mr. Thorne directly, making sure the crowd could hear. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Thorne. You came just in time. I turned slightly to include the gawking, horrified parents and students. Yesterday, Nina tried to take her own life on the rooftop 30 minutes before the exam. Kale ran to save her, and because of that he was late and missed the test. But when I stepped into the exam room, your son, Jax, started spewing filth about me, about my mother. I saw Mr. Thorne flinch as if I had physically struck him. I pressed on, merciless. The truth was my only weapon. He said he was going to make sure neither Kale nor I could take the college exam, so all your effort in tutoring us would go to waste. He even bragged that every time you guided a student he'd ruin one. He wanted to see the look on your face when we failed. The crowd erupted in a fresh wave of shock and outrage. This was a scandal far juicier and more twisted than a simple teenage quarrel or a failed student's rage. Jax's face, previously a mask of calculated calm, twisted with sheer, unvarnished shame and fury. You awful woman. Shut your mouth. Shut up, he snarled, struggling against the officer's hold. Mr. Thorne stood frozen, the truth I had told him over the phone now playing out in horrifying, public, undeniable reality. The last vestiges of denial in his eyes finally shattered. Though he had suspected, hearing the venom in his son's voice, seeing his vicious reaction confirmed everything. With a strangled cry of pure anguish and rage, a sound torn from the depths of a broken father. He snatched his heavy leather satchel and hurled it at Jax with all his strength. "I'll crush you, you beast. How could you? How could you do something like this?" The scene descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Captain Reed, worried the commotion would affect the thousands of other students trying to enter the exam hall, immediately handed a now subdued and broken-looking Kale over to other officers and grabbed the hysterical Mr. Thorne by the arm. "Stop it. That's enough. Don't affect the rest of the test takers. If you want to talk, we'll do it down at the station. Everyone clear the area." The gates to the exam hall were open. Students were streaming in, casting wide-eyed, terrified glances at the dramatic scene unfolding at their doorstep. I knew my role in this act was over. I had survived the ambush. I had spoken my truth. No matter how big the storm raged outside, nothing was more important now than the exam. It was my anchor, my purpose, my way out. I turned my back on the chaos, on Mr. Thorne's grief, on Jax's impotent fury, on Kale's utter devastation, and walked through the gates. The noise faded behind me, replaced by the solemn, focused silence of the examination center. I found my seat, arranged my pens on the desk, and took deep, calming breaths, forcing my racing heartbeat to slow, my trembling hands to still. The proctor began handing out the test papers. The outside world, with all its pain and betrayal, ceased to exist. There was only the paper, the questions, and my future. I picked up my pen. The second battle had been won. The final one was beginning. The final bell of the last exam rang, its shrill tone a definitive full stop. A collective, exhausted sigh seemed to ripple through the hall. It was over. The 2-day crucible was complete. I laid my pen down carefully, my fingers stiff and cramped. I felt hollowed out, a vessel drained of all the knowledge, fear, and determination I had poured into the test papers. The silence in the hall was profound, broken only by the rustle of papers and the soft footsteps of the proctors. As I filed out with the other students, a strange numbness settled over me. The high-alert state I had maintained for days was receding, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. The first thing I saw as I stepped through the main gates was not the lingering police presence or the remnants of the morning's chaos, but 3 familiar, dust-covered figures standing anxiously at the edge of the crowd. My parents and the village chief. My father and mother looked as though they had been carved from the very dust of the construction site. A fine gray powder coated their worn clothes and lined their tired faces. My father's hands, gripping the straps of a faded canvas bag, were a road map of cracks and calluses. My mother's shoulders, usually squared with a stubborn strength, seemed to sag under the weight of a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. They had come straight from their grueling labor, a journey of a day and a night, after undoubtedly hearing some terrifying fragmented version of events. The village chief, leaning heavily on his familiar wooden cane, scanned the crowd with an old man's keen eyes until they landed on me. In his gaze, I saw the collective hope and fear of our entire village, a weight I had carried for as long as I could remember. The vile slander Jax had spat about my mother rose unbidden in my mind, a foul odor I forcefully dismissed. I knew my mother. She was the strongest person I knew. She could handle the same back-breaking labor as my father, hauling bricks and mixing cement without a word of complaint. I remembered with a sudden sharp clarity, a time when some cruel neighbors had mocked me, suggesting I should give up studying and become a rich man's mistress to make easy money. It was my mother who had stormed out and cursed them with a ferocity that left them stunned into silence. Later she had pulled me aside, her work-roughened hands holding mine tightly, and told me, her voice low and fierce, "Don't you ever listen to that nonsense. You study. You study until your eyes cross. One day you'll go to a big city and work in an office tower with air conditioning. Don't be like me and your dad, breaking our backs for a pittance. Your mind is your way out." Seeing them here now, their love a tangible, grounding force in the aftermath of the storm, filled me with a warmth that began to thaw the icy dread Jax and Kale had left in me. It felt so good, so fundamentally right to be alive, to be loved, to have a future that was still, miraculously, within my grasp. We didn't speak much then. There was too much to say, and the noisy, chaotic street was not the place. My mother simply pulled me into a tight, dusty hug that smelled of sweat and home, and my father placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder, his silence more eloquent than any words. The village chief just nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotions too complex to name. "Let's get you somewhere quiet," was all he said, his voice raspy with emotion. We went straight to the police station. The scene inside was one of grim resolution, a stark contrast to the emotional reunion outside. I saw Cale's parents there huddled together on a hard wooden bench. They were simple farmers, their world consisting of the land they tilled and the son whose future they had poured their lives into. Now both had been ripped away in the most shocking manner possible. They looked small, lost, and utterly broken in the sterile, intimidating environment of the station. They couldn't even look at me. Captain Reed, his face a mask of professional neutrality, informed us of the formal outcomes. Cale was being held for causing a major disturbance, possession of a dangerous weapon and attempted murder. The gravity of the charges hung in the air, a suffocating blanket. He would be formally processed and detained, his fate now in the hands of the legal system. The boy I had grown up with was gone, replaced by a case file. Jax, thanks to his father's desperate, humiliating intervention and guarantees, had been allowed to finish his exams in a segregated room under the watchful eye of an officer. After each test, he had been brought back to the station for questioning. Captain Reed explained in his measured tone that strictly speaking, Jax hadn't lifted a hand. He had been a ghost in the machine, a masterful manipulator who had expertly avoided any direct prosecutable action. The legal system, he implied, would have a very difficult time making anything stick to him. He was the perfect parasite, draining his hosts while remaining unscathed himself. But then the unexpected happened. The door to one of the interrogation rooms opened and Nina was let out. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, but they blazed with a sudden, frantic energy. They landed on Cale, who was being formally processed at a desk, his head bowed. With a shriek that tore through the station's procedural quiet, she launched herself at him, her hands clawing at his face and arms like a wild animal. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare slander Jax. He didn't do any of this. It was all you. You're the one who did everything." The officers pulled her back, but she was a feral thing, her composure utterly shattered, all pretense gone. "Officer, I want to file a report," she screamed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Cale. "When I tried to commit suicide, it was because he hurt me. He forced me. He's the monster." Cale froze, his body going completely rigid with disbelief. He stared at her as if seeing a stranger, a terrifying imposter who had stolen the face of the girl he thought he loved. "You told me you loved me," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, a fragile thread of memory in the face of her hatred. "You said you wanted to be with me forever." But Nina's face was twisted with an open, visceral disgust, as if the very sight of him was repulsive. "Love you? Who would love a bookworm like you? A poor stupid mountain boy. You reek of sweat and failure. Every time I saw you I wanted to puke." The cruelty of her words was a physical blow, delivered with surgical precision. Cale recoiled as if struck, the last vestiges of his pride, his delusions, the entire narrative of his tragic love story, crumbling to dust around him. His parents, sitting on the bench, flinched, their faces masks of fresh pain. They were simple people. They didn't understand this level of malice. The village chief could take no more. He slammed his cane against the linoleum floor, the sharp crack echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Shameful," he roared, his old voice trembling with a fury that seemed to shake his entire frame. "You have disgraced yourselves. You have disgraced our entire village." As the officers finally led Cale away towards the holding cells and his bleak future, his steps were heavy, defeated. He was a shell. He passed right by me and his steps faltered. He stopped and looked at me, and in his eyes was the hollowed-out wreck of the boy I had once known, the boy who had shared stolen fruit with me under the summer sun. "Liana," he said, his voice raw, scraped clean of all anger, leaving only a vast, empty regret. "If I had listened to you back then, if I hadn't gone to Nina, would I have been able to take the exam too?" He was finally asking the right question. But it was a question born of consequence, not wisdom. It was far, far too late. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words sounding foreign on his lips. I never saw how malicious they were, wanting to destroy us. Luckily you didn't fall for it." A cold, clean anger rose in me, sharp and precise. I could not let him off that easily. He didn't get to play the repentant victim now that he was standing in the ruins of his own making. He didn't get to frame this as a tragedy that had happened to him, rather than one he had actively chosen at every turn. "Shut up, Kale," I said, my voice low and firm, cutting him off. "I would not offer him absolution. You can't blame anyone else for this. Not anymore. Blame yourself for letting your desire cloud your mind. You let your body control your brain. If you had listened to me and broken things off with Nina, if you had focused on what mattered, would you have turned your hatred on me? Would you be standing here right now?" He shook his head fiercely, desperate to explain, to find some scrap of redemption, to make me understand the puppet he had been. "No, never. No matter what, I could never hurt you. Not really. It was them, they. But the memory of my past life was a searing brand on my soul, more real than this moment. The feeling of his hands shoving me, the wind screaming in my ears, the ground rushing up. His tears now, his guilt, all of it felt no different than a crocodile's tears, shed only because he finally, truly understood the terrible, irrevocable price he was going to have to pay. "Liana, I was wrong. I really was wrong." "Then repent," I told him coldly, my gaze unwavering. "Go to prison and repent there." I turned my back on him. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say. For now, the immediate physical threat to my life was gone. My parents, horrified by the near miss, had immediately scraped together money to rent a cheap, clean room for me near the test center for the duration of the exams, insisting I get proper rest away from the dormitory. When they found out I had spent the previous night at the police station, they and the village chief went to thank Captain Reed profusely. My dad, a man of few words and immense pride, even tried to press 15 yuan, a significant sum for them, into the captain's hand for the boxed meal. Captain Reed refused gently but firmly, closing my father's hand around the money. "Absolutely not. Taking this would be wrong. It's just a meal, nothing more. You keep that." My dad, his face a picture of stubborn gratitude, kept trying to shove the money into the captain's pocket until I gently pulled his hand back. "Then thank you, Uncle Reed," I said, my voice full of a gratitude that went far deeper than words could express. "Thank you for everything." Mr. Thorne was also at the station, a broken man. His face was drawn and haggard, and he had aged a decade in a single day. He didn't say a word to me, his entire world reduced to the catastrophic failure of his son and the ruin of his own reputation. The bond between us, teacher and student, had been severed completely, cut by the twin blades of his son's malice and his own willful blindness. The next morning, with my parents and the village chief forming a protective phalanx around me, I walked into the exam hall for the final day of tests. I felt their strength at my back, a living bulwark against the world. I finished the last exam with the same focused intensity, the final barrier between the past and the future I was determined to claim. As I walked out, the entire grueling process finally over, I saw the police taking Jax away, this time with a more purposeful air. The questioning was over. Decisions were being made. Mr. Thorne stood by the gate, watching them lead his son away. As I passed, his eyes, full of a bitter, misplaced resentment, found me. The grief had curdled into blame. "If you'd told me sooner," he said, his voice low and accusing, "if you'd come to me privately, things never would have gone this far." I stopped and looked at him, this man who had once been my mentor, who had opened books and worlds for me. The connection was ashes. "I spent my time teaching you," he continued, the bitterness overflowing, tainting the memory of every extra lesson, every word of encouragement. "And in return, you bite the hand that fed you, Liana. You'll come to no good end." At that moment, any lingering sense of obligation or pity I might have felt for him or his son evaporated. He was blaming the victim, protecting the predator. He was as poisoned by his paternal bias as Jax was by his jealousy. He wanted a scapegoat for his own failure as a father. I looked Mr. Thorne squarely in the eye, my gaze steady and unforgiving. I felt the weight of the village chief and my parents behind me. "You should have taught your son better," I said quietly, and then I turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the ruins of his family and the consequences of his neglect. I would not carry his guilt. I had my own future to carry. The silence that followed the exams was not one of peace, but of suspended animation. The frantic mental energy that had sustained me for days evaporated, leaving me hollow and numb. We returned to the village, the journey a quiet, somber affair. The lush green mountains that had once felt like a prison now felt like a shield, a place to hide and heal. My parents, after ensuring I was settled, had to return to the construction site within a week. The dust on their clothes was a stark reminder that the world did not stop for our personal tragedies. The relentless grind of survival went on. The village chief, however, stayed close. He was a quiet, steady presence, his wrinkled face a map of our village's struggles. He knew the whispers were already beginning, slithering through the narrow paths between houses like venomous snakes. And they were. I heard them when I went to fetch water from the well, snippets of conversation that died the moment I approached. Kale was always a bright boy, it's a shame, a real shame. That city girl, Nina, she led him astray, poisoned his mind. And Liana. She was always with them, she should have tried harder to stop him, to make him see reason. Once a man goes to prison, he's finished. His poor parents, what will they do now? The narrative was already being woven, casting Kale as the tragic hero led astray by a temptress, and me as a bystander who should have done more. I knew it, but my parents never wanted me to hear, so I pretended I didn't. I focused on the physical world, on the ache in my muscles that was a welcome distraction from the ache in my heart. A week after we returned, I put on my oldest, most worn-out clothes, a pair of patched trousers and a faded shirt that had belonged to my father, and went to the construction site where my parents worked. It was a vast, dusty chaos of half-finished concrete skeletons and the constant percussive soundtrack of hammers and shouting. My father was where I always pictured him, his powerful frame silhouetted against the hazy sky, swinging a massive sledgehammer to break down an interior wall. The force of each blow reverberated through the ground, a dull rhythmic thud of pure brute force. My mother was carrying rubble down from the upper floors in 2 heavy buckets suspended from a bamboo pole across her shoulders. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her body leaning forward at a permanent angle against the immense, unending weight. I didn't say a word. I just found an extra pair of worn, fingerless gloves and started helping. I carried bricks in a heavy hod, my shoulders raw and swollen by the end of the first day. The rough wood and rope bit into my tender skin, and when sweat seeped into the fresh wounds, it stung like salt poured onto an open wound. I hauled bags of sand, the grit working its way into every pore under my nails, into the creases of my skin. For me, it was just summer work, a penance and a practical way to earn my university tuition money. For my mother, this was her daily life, repeated endlessly year after year. Her shoulders were not just raw, they were a permanent landscape of hardened, leathery calluses and old, white scars, a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice. Her hands were rough as sandstone, the nails cracked and permanently stained with dirt. All my life I had heard the old saying, if you don't suffer through studying, you'll suffer through life. But hearing it 1,000 times from teachers and the village chief was nothing compared to living it, even for a day. The brutal, mind-numbing, body-breaking exhaustion of manual labor was a more potent, more visceral motivator than any lecture could ever be. This was the alternative. This was the future I had fought so desperately to avoid. My mother misunderstood my quiet intensity, my grim determination to share their burden. One evening, as I winced applying a cheap, stinging salve to my inflamed shoulders, she sat beside me on our cramped porch, her voice gentle. "Don't be afraid," she said, mistaking my silence for worry about the impending exam results. "If you don't pass this time, we'll repeat the year. Your dad and I talked it over. We've saved a little money, put some aside with your grandma. If you need to repeat, we won't use the village's money again. We'll manage it ourselves." Her words, meant to comfort, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. They were willing to sacrifice even more, to bear an even heavier burden, to delay their own rest for my dream. They saw my work on the site as a sign of despair, not of solidarity. I just nodded, unable to speak around the lump of love and guilt. Kale's parents, meanwhile, ran themselves ragged trying to find a lawyer, to plead for leniency, to understand the legal labyrinth that had swallowed their son. But the evidence was overwhelming. The knife, the public disturbance witnessed by hundreds, the testimony of Captain Reed and countless parents. The village whispers about them grew louder, more pitying, and in some corners more accusatory. The collective investment of the village had been betrayed, and the shame, it seemed, was collective too. The village chief, in a move that was both harsh and necessary for the community's morale, made a public example. He struck Kale's name from the family register in the village hall, a public, symbolic act of severing him from the community that had raised him. He even used Kale's case as a stark lesson during a village meeting, standing on the old stone steps in the central square. The village scrapes together money to send our children to school. His voice boomed, old but firm, carrying across the silent, assembled crowd. We do it so that everyone can make something of themselves, so later they can repay the village and lead everyone toward prosperity. We carry the water so they can drink. But some people, he paused, his gaze sweeping over everyone, are selfish. They think only of their own desires. They nearly caused an enormous loss, almost costing us the first top scorer from our entire village. They spit on the sacrifices we all made. He didn't say Kale's name, but everyone knew. The message was clear. The community's future was paramount. Individual failures that jeopardized that future would be cut out like a cancer. It was brutal, but it was the survival logic of a place with no margin for error. Then the day arrived. The university admission letters were being delivered. I was at the construction site, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, my shirt soaked with sweat, hauling a heavy bucket of mortar when the village chief came running. He was usually so measured, so dignified, but now he was sprinting, his face flushed with an emotion I hadn't seen on him in years. Unbridled, explosive joy. Liana, it's here. Your score. You. He was gasping for breath, bending over with his hands on his knees, unable to form the words. I stopped, the heavy bucket dropping from my hands with a thud. The world seemed to slow down. What is it, uncle? He straightened up, his eyes wide, tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. 748. You scored 748 points. You are the provincial top scorer. The Zhuangyuan. The news exploded through our sleepy, dusty mountain village like a string of firecrackers. It was more than anyone had dared to hope for. The acceptance letter hadn't even arrived yet, but within days representatives from the top universities in Beijing and reporters from major provincial media outlets were already winding their way up the treacherous, bumpy mountain roads. Even a senior government official came in person, his sleek car a bizarre sight in our dirt-poor village. Our small, humble home, with its packed earth floor and fading posters on the wall, was suddenly the center of a universe I never knew existed. Well-dressed men and women in sharp suits and clean shoes stood in our dusty courtyard, making promises that sounded like something from a fairy tale. Student Liana, take a look at our university's prospectus. Tuition and housing are completely free. Meals are covered too. And every semester there's a guaranteed scholarship of at least 10,000 yuan. One recruiter from a prestigious tech university promised, his voice smooth and persuasive. In my previous life, I hadn't achieved such a stellar score. I had only just reached the cutoff for the top universities, a hard-won victory nonetheless. But this time, after each exam and my second chance, I had meticulously copied down every single mistake, analyzing every conceptual error, drilling the correct answers into my mind until they were as familiar as my own heartbeat. That relentless, almost obsessive focus, born from the searing knowledge of what true failure felt like, had yielded an unimaginable result. Amid the flurry of handshakes and photographs, the officials asked if I had any difficulties, any needs. This was my chance. This was the moment I could pay back a fraction of the debt I owed. I told them about our village, our small, forgotten corner of the world without even a primary school. I described how children, some as young as 6, had to ride their bicycles for 20 kilometers over rugged, dangerous mountain paths to the nearest big village to study. I spoke of the isolation, the lack of opportunity. To prosper, we must first build roads, I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying over the crowd of villagers and officials and the clicking cameras. And we must build a school, a proper school, so that the children from our village can study safely, close to their families. So that no child has to risk their life for an education. In front of the media's gaze, the officials, beaming with the positive publicity, gave their word on the spot. They pledged to fund the road, a proper paved road, and to build a new modern primary school. They even awarded me a special provincial stipend and a large, bright red banner of commendation, which the village chief immediately and proudly hung in the most prominent place in the village hall, right next to the faded portrait of a national leader. In the end, after careful consideration, I applied for the finance program at Tsinghua University. It felt like the right tool, the precise instrument I needed to one day help not just myself, but my entire village, to understand the flows of money and opportunity that had always bypassed us. The day I was to leave for Beijing, the entire village gathered to see me off. The gossip about Kale had vanished, completely erased by a collective pride so potent it was almost a physical thing, a warmth you could feel in the air. I was no longer just Liana. I was their Liana, the one who had put our forgotten village on the map. They pressed gifts into my hands, hard-boiled eggs, homemade pickles, carefully folded bills, their faces alight with a hope that was now, finally, attached to a tangible reality. My parents, beaming with a pride that seemed to erase years of weariness from their faces, personally accompanied me on the train to Beijing. It was their first time leaving the province. As the old, green-painted engine chugged its way out of the mountains, my mother, sitting beside me, gossiped about the final fates of those who had tried to drag us down, her voice a low murmur against the rhythm of the tracks. Kale was sentenced to 10 years, she said, her voice holding no malice, only a sort of weary sadness. Mr. Thorne resigned. No one would have him as a teacher after that. He's been running around trying to get a lighter sentence for Jax, but it's not looking good. The instigation is hard to prove. She shook her head in disapproval. And that Nina girl. She leaned closer. She got pregnant. No one knows for sure who the father is. His family took him to a small back-alley clinic to deal with it. Word of it spread like wildfire. His reputation is ruined. No decent family will have him now. I listened, but the news felt distant, like a story about people I had never really known. They were ghosts from a past life, their dramas and downfalls no longer having any power over me. They were cautionary tales. I was the new chapter. When the train finally pulled into the vast, overwhelming cacophony of Beijing Station, I stepped onto the platform and was struck by a wave of sensory overload. The sheer scale, the deafening noise, the dizzying pace of life. The capital city I had only ever seen in grainy photographs and tattered books now stood vividly, overwhelmingly, terrifyingly before me. Tsinghua University, a treasure of 100 years, stood as a monument to knowledge and ambition, its gates welcoming the nation's brightest talents from every corner of the land. In that moment, standing on the threshold of this new, daunting world, all my ambitions, once suppressed by the sheer effort of survival, surged forth, impossible to contain. Yet I knew my own shortcomings. I wasn't naturally brilliant or well-connected. I was stubborn. I was hardworking. I was a fighter. And I knew that in this new, glittering arena, that would have to be enough. The air in Beijing was different. It tasted of coal dust, ambition, and the frantic, pulsing energy of 20 million lives colliding. Tsinghua's campus was a world unto itself, a sprawling kingdom of ancient, gnarled trees and soaring modern glass buildings, of students who walked with an aura of unshakable confidence that felt both intimidating and contagious. For the first few weeks, I felt like a fraud, a simple mountain girl who had stumbled into a palace by accident. My clothes were cheap and plain, my accent marked me as an outsider from a backward province, and the casual references my new classmates made to international travel, fine dining, and luxury brands were a language I didn't speak. But I had my stubbornness. I had my hunger. While others went out to explore the city's vibrant nightlife or joined clubs and social circles, I stayed in the library, its quiet, scholarly hum of familiar comfort. I poured everything into my studies and into competitions. Math modeling, economic debates, financial case studies. I completed every assignment from my professors with a meticulousness born from the knowledge that my place here was a miracle, paid for by the sweat of my parents and the collective hopes of my village. I couldn't waste a single second. Every moment of relaxation felt like a betrayal of those who had lifted me up. Maybe it was luck, or perhaps it was this relentless, almost grim drive, but in my junior year, my stern but fair finance professor, impressed by my performance in his class and my competition results, recommended me for an internship at one of the city's top venture capital firms, Apex Capital. It was a brutal, hyper-competitive environment, a glass and steel hive where money was a living, breathing entity and decisions worth millions were made between sips of expensive espresso. I was a small, insignificant cog, assigned to a project group focusing on emerging tourism trends. My manager, a sharp, perpetually busy woman in her 30s named Ms. Anya Sharma, explained the thesis during a morning meeting in a conference room with a stunning view of the smoggy city skyline. Big cities are creating immense pressure, mental and physical. There's a growing, affluent urban demographic that longs to return to nature, to authenticity, to something real. We're looking for the next wave of eco-resorts, genuine experiences, not manufactured, theme park ones. as my colleagues, mostly sons and daughters of the elite, threw out ideas about developing hot springs in already commercialized areas or repurposing ancient villages into boutique hotels, my heart began to pound. An image of my home flashed in my mind, so vivid it was almost a hallucination. The mist-shrouded peaks at dawn, the clear, icy streams teeming with little fish, the simple, sturdy wooden houses clinging to the mountainside, the sound of the wind in the bamboo groves. Our people were honest, their hospitality not a service but a way of life. Our traditions were unique, our festivals vibrant with a history that hadn't been sanitized for tourists. Visitors could hike our untouched trails, forage for wild mushrooms with local guides, wade in the rivers to catch their own dinner, learn to make rice wine from the elders. It wouldn't be a resort. It would be an immersion, a journey back in time. I raised my hand, my voice slightly unsteady in the room of polished, confident voices. I have a proposal. All eyes turned to me, the quiet, always over-prepared intern from the mountains. I took a deep breath and began to paint a picture with my words. I spoke of my village, not with the shame I had once felt, but with a newfound, fierce pride. I described the untouched beauty, the crisp, clean air, the unique ethnic festivals with their dragon dances and ancient songs, the potential for authentic homestays where visitors could live and eat with local families, sharing their stories around a communal fire. The people are simple and honest, I said, my voice growing stronger, more assured. We have a culture that hasn't been packaged and sold yet. It's raw, real. It could be a truly unique, high-end eco-resort model that offers something no one else can, genuine connection. Ms. Sharma was silent for a moment, tapping her expensive pen on the glass table. Her expression was unreadable. It's a compelling narrative. The untouched angle is strong, and the authenticity is a valuable selling point in a saturated market. She looked at me, her gaze analytical, dissecting. Draft a proposal. Initial market analysis, potential ROI, logistical challenges, community engagement strategy. Let's see if the numbers hold up to the poetry. That very night I didn't sleep. I sat in my tiny shared dorm room, the city lights blinking like a field of cold stars beyond my window, and drafted the proposal. I channeled all my academic training, all my intimate lifelong knowledge of the land and its people into the document. I ran financial models, analyzed tourist demographic data, outlined sustainable development plans. It wasn't just a business plan. It was a lifeline, thrown back towards the home I had left behind. I called the project Peak Harmony. The next morning I slid the printed document onto Ms. Sharma's desk. She read it in silence, her expression giving nothing away. Finally she looked up. This is surprisingly thorough. The community-based model is smart. It mitigates risk and enhances the authentic experience. The company has been looking to invest in underdeveloped regions as part of a new government-aligned initiative. It's good PR and good business. We'll schedule a site inspection. If this works, Lena, it could be a flagship project for us. Elation and terror warred within me. It was one thing to dream, to use my home as an abstract concept in a business proposal. It was another to have a corporate giant like Apex Capital turn its powerful, calculating gaze upon the quiet, fragile reality of my village. I immediately called the village chief. His voice, crackling over the poor connection, was initially confused, then stunned, then ecstatic. They're coming here? City investors? To invest? Lena, is this real? Is this truly happening? It's real, I said, my voice trembling with the magnitude of it. We need to prepare. Clean up the main paths. Have the best cooks prepare a meal, our local specialties. Choose a few elders who can speak clearly about our traditions and history. We need to show them our best face, our true face. Not a performance but our real life at its best. If this project worked, it would change everything. It would rewrite the future of our village. My parents wouldn't need to travel far for backbreaking, temporary construction jobs. The other villagers wouldn't need to migrate south to work in anonymous, soul-crushing factories. The children, my little cousins and the neighbors' kids, wouldn't be left behind anymore, raised by grandparents while their parents worked 1,000 miles away. Instead, everyone could come home. They could set up small stalls selling local crafts and food, offer guiding services, open their homes to tourists, perform our traditional music and dances. The money would flow into the village, not out of it. It would be a circular economy of our own making. This was the dream the chief had always harbored but never dared to articulate so clearly. He had hoped we would go out into the world and succeed. But this meant we could all return and succeed together. We could prove that our home had value beyond the timber that could be chopped down or the minerals that could be dug up. A few weeks later, I traveled back to the village with the inspection team from Apex Capital, Ms. Sharma and 2 senior analysts, both of whom looked deeply skeptical about the long, bumpy journey. The trip felt different this time. I was no longer just a student returning home. I was a conduit, a translator between 2 vastly different worlds. The village had transformed. The paths were swept clean, colorful hand-stitched banners were hung between houses, and the air was thick with the mouth-watering smell of roasting sweet potatoes, smoked pork and festive anticipation. The villagers looked at me with a new kind of respect, a hopeful awe, as if I were a magician who had conjured this opportunity out of thin air. During the tour, as Ms. Sharma questioned the chief about land rights, water sources and infrastructure with a sharp, professional focus, I slipped away for a moment. A group of my old schoolmates, their faces now weathered by sun and hard labor, had organized a small impromptu reunion in my honor at one of their homes. It was there, surrounded by familiar faces that were now etched with the hardships of a life I had escaped, that I learned the final chilling chapter of the story I thought I had left behind. "Did you hear about Kale?" one of them asked, his voice dropping to a somber tone as he passed me a cup of bitter tea. I shook my head, a cold premonition settling in the pit of my stomach. I had deliberately not asked. He was released early. Good behavior, they said. He took a slow sip of his tea, his expression grim. But he didn't repent. The moment he got out, he went looking for Nina. Nina, I was told, had long since been married off to a middle-aged truck driver from a neighboring county, a match of convenience and desperation. She was 8 months pregnant with his child. The moment Kale saw her, my classmate continued, his voice a hushed, horrified whisper, he didn't say a word. He didn't shout or accuse. He just walked up to her and ended her life. They said his last words to her were, "You ruined my life. Why should you get to live well? Didn't you say you loved me? Then come with me to hell. Let's be a pair of doomed lovers down there." A collective grim shudder went through our small group. The monstrousness of it was absolute, a final violent punctuation to a story that had always been headed toward tragedy. But it didn't stop there. Another classmate, a woman named May, chimed in, her eyes wide with the horror of the telling. "He ran straight to Mr. Thorne's house. He blamed the teacher for everything. The one he hated was you, wasn't it? If you hadn't cursed him and beaten him all the time, why would he have put all the blame on me? You deserve to pay for this too." She paused, swallowing hard. "He dealt with both him and his wife. Right there in their own home." My blood ran cold, freezing in my veins. Mr. Thorne, for all his final betrayal of me, for his willful blindness, had been a dedicated teacher once. He had opened doors for me. The image of him and his wife, victims of the very monster his own son had helped create and nurture, was too horrifying to fully comprehend. After that, the first classmate said, Kale called the police and turned himself in, just calmly waited for them to arrive. But even in prison he wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "He got hold of a piece of dental floss," they said. "He managed to get into Jax's cell, or maybe they were put together. He strangled him. His last words to him were, 'Didn't you say you treated me as a brother? Then come keep me company. If I can't live, none of you will live either.'" The story was a Greek tragedy played out in our poor remote corner of the world. Kale had become an agent of pure nihilistic chaos, a fire that consumed everything in its path, systematically destroying every person he held responsible for his ruin, ultimately completing the circle of annihilation that Jax had set in motion with his petty, jealous scheming. The puppet had finally killed the puppeteer and then himself. I learned that Kale's parents, after initially running themselves ragged trying to save him, had finally given up, utterly crushed by the shame and the unspeakable horror. They had retreated into a silent, broken existence. By the time I returned to the village, I heard they had a new child, a little boy conceived in a desperate attempt to start over, who was already old enough to walk and knew nothing of the brother who had torn their world apart. The reunion broke up soon after, the festive mood I had carried with me utterly shattered by the grim news. I walked back to the inspection team, the bright, hopeful sunlight now feeling obscene, a mockery of the darkness that had festered here. The past, it seemed, was not content to stay dead. It had reached out from the grave with one final, bloody, conclusive gasp. Ms. Sharma found me a few minutes later, her professional mask slightly softened by the stunning, visceral beauty of the landscape. "This place has real potential, Lena," she said, her gaze taking in the majestic peaks. "The authenticity is palpable. You can feel it. But..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Are the people here stable? We heard some disturbing stories from the locals while you were away. About a multiple homicide. A crime of passion that wiped out several families." I looked out at the village, at the hopeful, eager faces of the people who had gathered to see the city investors. I thought of Kale, a black hole of resentment that had ultimately consumed everything around him, and of Jax, the cunning spider who had woven a web that ultimately trapped and killed him. They were the poison that had been purged. "The people here are resilient, Miss Sharma," I said, my voice steady, pushing the horror aside, locking it away in a deep, dark corner of my mind. This was about the future now. They have endured much. They have seen the very worst that can happen when hope turns to poison. And they are still here. They are ready to build a better future, a future they can be proud of. The past. I met her gaze squarely. The past is a ghost. It can't hurt this village anymore. It's a lesson, not a life sentence. She studied my face for a long, penetrating moment, seeing the resolve there, the hard-won strength. Then she nodded slowly, a decision made. "Good. Then let's talk numbers. Let's talk about how we turn this peak harmony of yours into a reality." And as we walked back to join the others, I took one last look at the mountains, my mountains. They were no longer just a place I had escaped from. They were the foundation of everything I was about to become. The bridge was being built, and this time it was built to last. The end.